Hey everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It's great to see that much interest on the last panel of the last day. So I hope this can be as exciting as possible, and what could be more exciting than the archived web, right? So here I am talking about preservability and preservation of digital scholarly editions. And a little bit of background to where I'm coming from. I've done my PhD working with web archives and creating web archives and working with archived web data. And I'm currently a postdoc in this editions project that looks at scholarly publishing of born digital material. And what we're especially interested in is creating a data schema that would allow us to, in a scholarly way, represent born digital data. And with this talk, so I'm wearing two hats, I always like to say, and with this talk, I'm trying to wear them both at the same time. I'm trying to speak to the web archiving community, and I'm also trying to explain a little bit about the preservation needs of digital scholarly editions. And what we're going to do now in the next few minutes is we are going to go up, talk a little bit about a case study that I've recently made. The case study looks at how scholarly editions online are preserved, what their preservation status is. I brought some examples that we're going to go through, and then after that we're going to bridge that and we talk about what the specific, what the overlap is between web archiving and digital scholarly editions. And just to get a few definitions out of the way, so when I say digital scholarly editions, I really mean it in the most textual scholarship history kind of sense, your classic edition where you would have your high quality reproduction, could be a photograph, a scan, and then you'd have your facsimile, you'd have your transcriptions and the annotations. You might have a critical apparatus that shows you the tradition of the text, and you would also have a lot of annotation. This is really where it's at. And this is what makes scholarly editions, or I'm just going to call them DSEs from now on, what makes DSEs so special and what makes them complex resources for the purpose of this talk is that they have those three layers, right? So they have your primary data layer, which might just be the transcribed text. Then they have the actual transcriptions that are overlaid on that. They have the annotations. And of course, on top of that, they have the presentation being what you would see in a web browser if you query that. And regarding preservation, I'm mostly referring to keeping usable copies of their online presence available online. So I'm aware that a lot of this data that we're going to go through in a moment might just be in some institution's repository. But usually, if that's a TEI-based edition, it would be the TEI files. What I'm interested in is really for editions that have an online presence, that are public research outputs, is the preservability of these outputs. And so to talk about the case study I did, I wanted to find out, as I said, what the preservation status of these editions is. And to do that, first I wanted to build a corpus, and then I wanted to check what the URL status would be. So I went to the most comprehensive source of information on digital scholarly editions. That is a list called Catalog of Digital Scholarly Editions. It's maintained by Patrick Sahle. And it lists about 800 of these edition projects. It's not a complete list. Sahle himself says that it is more an annotated list of editions that he found worthwhile adding here. But anyway, that would give you about 800 editions. The oldest edition projects date back to 1988. And what's very nice here for the purpose of this is, of course, that the source data is available. So you can just download the source data of GitHub. And from there on, it's easy. What I've done is I've extracted all the URLs that refer to digital editions. There's some URLs that point you to reviews or further information, but I wasn't interested in those. I only wanted to get the actual URL that points me to the project. And then I ran a very simple HTTP status checker to see what the status of this URL would be. And I'm skipping forward a slide here because I want you to have a look at the results. So very briefly, those are the results over time, right? Scaled up to 100% for each year, and the year is the year that the edition project started. Everything in blue is either an HTTP status 200, which means successful connection was made, or it's a successful redirect, basically saying the server sent me to another server because the resource has moved, and I took that as indication of this URL is still live and the resource is still available here. Everything you see in red are file not found for errors. So these are obviously means that the request couldn't be completed, nothing was there, the edition is probably down. What you see in brown is either server configuration errors, so you wouldn't have permission to access the file. It could be various errors. Sometimes you would see outdated SSL certificates on those brown things. So we found out that DSEs suffer from link rot and general attrition over time. Considering their web resources, that probably surprises nobody in this room. But considering that the output of funded research projects, this is, I think, where we should start to see, we should think about it, because we see that the problem of preserving these resources in a sustainable way has not been solved on a large scale. If we look at the sheer numbers, we simply see that we still lose those editions, even though we shouldn't. They're research projects, they came out of funded projects, and they should be kept around. And now you're probably wondering what the yellow part is. The yellow part is where I've started to notice something strange in the URLs. And the yellow part are URLs that point to the Internet Archive. So the yellow part is an edition that's no longer available on the live web. It is only available as a copy or a partial copy in the Internet Archive. And I think this is where it starts to get very interesting. So you can see that it shows how important web archives are for the preservation of these resources. You can see, there's a side note here, Patrick Salas started compiling this data in 2004, I believe he said. So you see there's this sharp rise. There were so many editions that he would have never known about if it hadn't been for the Internet Archive, probably. And then towards the end, okay, the results are a little bit skewed because we don't have a whole lot of very old editions. But we can see here, Internet Archive is a very important provider for the preservation of these, and there is a lot of editions that would be lost if it wasn't for web archiving. Okay, that methodology isn't perfect, and we're going to go through that in a little bit. And I'm going to do that through looking at some examples. So here's an example of an edition that is preserved in the Internet Archive, the Samuel Taylor Coleridge Archive. And it is a very, I want to say, almost a flat file edition. It is it's a very classic look of edition with the text and the transcription. The internal links still work. They take you to other archive pages. Some of the external links are broken, but you can still access that, and you can still get the same information out that you could have on the live web. So that would come back as one of the yellow parts, an edition that's in the Internet Archive, and we can say, okay, this is pretty much fully functional in this copy on the Internet Archive. And then there are other cases where we've received a 404 and it might log as a red part, as a file not found error, but the edition is still online. Example here, the Auchinleck manuscript. So if you follow the link, it takes you to this file not found page by the National Library of Scotland. But if you search on the web, you find that the edition is still actually live on the live web. And what happened is simply the URL has changed, but no redirect was made, which is a bit strange here, thinking that it went from this directory to a subdomain on nls.uk, but there was no redirect made, and this also hints at another problem. There simply is no persistent identifier system for these editions, and that means if no one bothers to update the URLs, then at some point even Salas list will be outdated. So, this might register as a 404, but if you do a little bit of research, you find out the edition is still live. And similarly, you would have successful connections, but the edition itself actually isn't there anymore. So this is the Bosworth Letters project. That would come back as a 200 because a successful connection to the server was made. But then you see that, you just get this Omeka error page and you can't access the edition anymore. That might be an example of what you might call this a dying edition. This might just be it's unclear if anyone has been informed of this error, if anyone has the time and the knowledge to respond to this error and fix it and bring it back online. It's completely unclear. I've seen different results looking at especially the SSL certificates, because they're usually the first thing to go. They usually last 3 months and then they need to be renewed. So if you get those errors 50-50 that they are resolved within a couple of weeks, or it just shows that there's no more maintenance for this edition project and it's now slowly going to fall into ruin. So again, that would be a successful connection, but in reality, you would see the edition is unavailable. And then finally, there's editions that are only partially preserved. This is The Dream of the Rood, an electronic edition, and you can see it here. This is partially preserved in the Internet Archive. It works with embedded iframes, and as you can imagine, that is not the best setup to have your website preserved for a long time. So only some parts of the edition are still available at the moment, because if we go forward here, we see that, and these aren't external links, these are parts of the edition. So some pages work, and some pages just take you to this error page. And that shows that, that was an iframe that was trying to pull content from this just host com. And it's unclear if the crawler didn't get it, or it's unclear if that was shut down by the time the crawler got to it. But in any case, the point to make there is that, right, so scholarly editions are subject to link rot at rates similar to other websites. And the study found that they disappear. Their loss rate is kind of stable. And practically, just looking at the numbers and looking at this little case study, the Internet Archive is a substantial provider of infrastructure for scholarly editions, even though it is unlikely to produce a perfect usable copy in the sense that a scholar could continue using these editions. Especially because really where the money is at with editions is usually the annotations, the critical apparatus, and that is usually something that, especially if you imagine that there is any kind of mouse over annotations, that is not something that is likely to be preserved. So, because web archives obviously capture the front end of edition. So far, for the short excursion into the preservation status of editions. Now, the questions in preservability, and this is where we come back to web archives in general and the topic of this session, is what are the specific needs of these projects? What makes them special, and how is that represented in archiving solutions? Because I'm definitely not the first person to talk about this problem, right? And this problem has been described, and different solutions exist. I'm listing some systems and approaches here. There has been this framework developed, which generally says that there is different compromises between accessibility and longevity in the preservation, pretty much of any application, but this specifically refers to scholarly editions online. So basically, if you have the funds to have this continuously maintained, then you can keep it continuously online. However, this is probably not the case for most solutions. So I've put a few up there, and we can go through them. So the HDC, the first one there on the left, that was an approach to preserve editions through emulation, and that worked very well where it worked, but you can imagine that that's not a solution that is available to every edition, because this means continuous and ongoing work for every project that you take on, and you know there's just only so much work you can put into it. You can rely on the Internet Archive to have your DSE preserved. We've seen that, and it might work in some cases. And very practically, it might also be one of the few options that are open to some projects. However, that is not likely to preserve a complete copy. You might also choose to rely on existing repositories. I just put TextGrid there, but there's many others. So TextGrid runs off the DARIA infrastructure, which means if you do have access to this academic infrastructure, then that's where you can put your data. And using TextGrid, you can visualize it on the web, which also means you are less reliant on a custom-made system. You're using something that is already there. And finally, of course, there is ads. It's a Jekyll theme for minimal editions, called something like Gitlit. Allows you to put XML files on GitHub, and then using this Jekyll theme, have them transformed into HTML and build something that's called a flat file edition, where you use the least amount of server infrastructure possible, and you're only really concerned with the files. The XML files come in and the HTML files go out. A big plus of that, of course, is that you can just go on and archive the XML files, and you're quite likely to preserve the edition completely. And then there's one thing that is, I think, very popular, and it's missing here, but I think we all know it. It's just that informal work to keep those editions alive. You know, old editions that live in your department or in your school, and someone, as long as they have the time and as long as they have the resources available, they just maintain them without being acknowledged for it, because that is just how many of these are just kept alive. I've personally seen it with two that didn't make it, I think, past the third year. Digital editions that just disappeared because of changes in the department, because resources disappeared, and also because of copyright issues. Thank you. So moving on. what are possible solutions? Briefly talked about that, like what are possible solutions if you are working in a scholarly editing project. Very generally, there's no perfect solution to this. Generally, reduce custom-made systems if you don't plan to maintain them. That's a good quote, right? So rather make a flat file solution, because that is just way more likely to be around. Otherwise, think research data management and preservation from the start, which is now required in many funding applications. But as we've seen in older editions, in practice, it's just not always there. And then coming back to the web archiving community, what's the solution? Should we look at dedicated crawls for edition projects that are still online? Would this maybe be something that especially national libraries would be interested in to preserve editions that are housed in their national institutions? Because I argue there's more to the edition than simply the XML files. Also the presentation, the interface, and so on, all forms part of this edition. So the first part is, acknowledge that there's loss, acknowledge that web archives, as important as they are not perfect solutions to this loss. And I think the potential lies on both sides to, one, design your edition with preservability in your mind from the start, and then secondly, also for the web archiving community, just acknowledge that these resources are both important and quite vulnerable to deletion. So that's what I'm trying to do in my conclusion, and that's why I'm trying to speak to both camps and wear both hats at the same time, kind of. There's no universal solution to this problem, although different approaches exist, and different approaches might be suitable for different projects. Research has shown how important web archives are for these editions, and because without them, most of them would be lost forever. Think about if we didn't have the Internet Archive, how many of these editions and how much of this knowledge that scholars have produced we wouldn't have access to. There's opportunities on both sides. Dedicated crawl of older live DSEs is something that I would like to start. I would be happy to get involved there. And then very practically, our project has also developed a super minimal computing framework that only is an XLST transformation. So that means you simply give it your TI encoded XML files and outcome static HTML documents. And we did this hoping that it would just encourage people to make editions, and it would also encourage people to build very accessible editions so that you're not required on a fancy custom-made framework. And yeah, with that, I'm leaving you and I conclude. I want to thank you very much. If you found this interesting, then I encourage you to get in touch with me. I put my socials up there, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion later. Thank you very much.